Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Today is November 17th, 2012. Okay, so good morning, everybody, and welcome back, or I should welcome myself back. After 3 weeks of just wandering around in sunny California. Blazing hot there some of the days. While my poor friends on the East Coast have to struggle with superstorms and snowfalls. I hope, especially you in New Jersey, might have been hit pretty hard by that superstorm. Well named, the superstorm. Okay, so now we are going to study Sutta number 87 in the Majjhima Nikāya. I see a number of new people here. Who is new? Who hasn't been here before? You're completely new? You've been here before. Yeah. Yeah, so we've been working for the new people. We work through the suttas in the Majjhima Nikāya, the middle-length discourses of the Buddha. If I knew there would be new people coming, we would have made some photocopies of the sutta. But if you're sitting, new people, if you could sit next to somebody who has a copy of the book, then maybe 2 people could look on at the same time. Okay, so this is the sutta, Piyajatika Sutta. It means born from those who are dear. And it's a pretty simple sutta. The structure is quite simple. And the message is quite simple as well. Okay, we'll go through and read it and then I'll comment on it. Okay, the sutta begins, the page, this is page 718. Chi ba. Yeah. Chi ba, yeah. Okay, so on this occasion, the Buddha is living at Savatthi, and this is somewhat significant. Usually when it mentions the place where the Buddha is living, it doesn't really tie in with the content of the sutta, but in this case it will. Because as we'll see, the sutta moves on to the king of the state of Kosala, whose capital is Savatthi. Okay, so at the time that the sutta begins, a certain householder's dear and beloved only son had died. Okay, since this is the only son, and probably in all very if there's an only son, he'll be cherished very, very much by his parents. But in India, there's a very special tie between the parents, and if there are several sons, it will be with the oldest son. And if there's only one son, that tie to the single son will be even stronger. Because according to the traditional Indian religious ritual, or religious system, it's the eldest son, or if there's just one son, it's that only son who performs what's called the sadhya, or the shraddha rites for the parents after they pass away. Okay, but when this householder's son had died, it seems that he lost all desire to live on, all hope of life. So it's said that after his son's death, he had no more desire to work, no more desire to eat. And he kept on going to the charnel ground. You know, in India, they will not bury the body, but they'll cremate the body, and then they'll deposit the ashes in the charnel ground. And he would go there, and he would always be crying and lamenting, "My only son, where are you? My only son, where are you?" You know, it's like he's a little bit, you could say, out of his mind, because he thinks that by crying in the charnel ground, he'll be able to get his son back. This happens sometimes, you know, if a man loses his wife, he'll go to the cemetery and start weeping, "Where are you, my wife? Where are you, my wife? Please come back to me. Please come back to me." And the wife will lament for her husband, "Please come back. Please come back." Okay, so this householder is really in a desperate condition, dejected, miserable, depressed, no more desire to go on living. And probably he heard that the Buddha is a wise man who helps people overcome their misery and suffering. So he goes to the Buddha and he pays homage to him, and probably he wants to ask the Buddha for advice. But even before he can speak up to the Buddha notices that this householder seems to be, you say, out of his mind, completely unhinged. And so the Buddha says to him, "Your faculties are not those in control of his mind. Your faculties seem to be deranged." Normally, can we detect somebody whose faculties are deranged just by seeing him? Or does one have to question such a person to find out? What's your opinion about that? Sometimes if you travel the subway in New York, sometimes just looking at a person, it seems, Richard? Lots of what? Shrinks. A psychotherapist. Yeah. I think that seems to be possible. Yeah. Do we have any psychotherapists here? If you are, you could speak up. Don't be shy. Okay, so apparently the Buddha, of course, would be able to tell just by looking at this householder. It's a little bit strange. Usually the Buddha wouldn't speak to somebody in that way. Usually the Buddha would just wait patiently until a person speaks his own mind. But for some reason, maybe the Buddha wants to lead him on by offering this comment. And so when the Buddha says this, then the householder says, "How could I not be deranged? Because my dear and beloved only son has died." And then he says, since he's died, I have no more desire to work, to eat, but I just keep on going to the charnel ground, hoping to get him back. Okay, and so from this sort of confession of the householder, the Buddha makes a generalization. He says, "So it is, householder, so it is. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are born from those who are dear. They arise from those who are dear." So this is a kind of general principle that the Buddha lays down It's similar to a verse that occurs in the Dhammapada. Let's go. Piyajatika soko, piyato jayati soko, bayang jayati, piyato jayato bayang. Nati piyang, nati soko, nat. I can't remember the exact words, but the English translation I know. From what is dear arises grief or sorrow. From what is dear arises fear. When there is nothing dear, there is no grief. How then can there be fear? Okay, we'll discuss this later, but let's just go on with the sutta. Okay, now when the Buddha says this, the householder is not very happy with his comment. In fact, he openly repudiates the Buddha. He says, "Who would ever think that sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair could be born from those who are dear, could arise from those who are dear? Rather, it's happiness and joy, ananda somanasa, that are born from those who are dear, that arise from those who are dear." And then that householder, he was displeased with the Buddha's words. He disapproved of them, and then he went off, he departed from the Buddha. Okay, now the text continues, and this seems a little strange, since the Buddha is said to have been living at Savatthi and Jeta's Grove. But then the text says, on that occasion some gamblers were playing with dice, not far from the Blessed One. It seems a little strange to me, since one would think that if, the Buddha is living there, even people who don't have faith in the Buddha, still they would have some respect for somebody who's reputed to be a holy man, and that if they want to play dice, they would go some distance away. One wouldn't be playing dice right next to near the Buddha. But maybe the sense is that the gamblers were playing dice, not 20 yards away or 30 yards away, but maybe they were playing dice someplace outside of Jeta's Grove. But it would be, near enough, like 2 blocks away, like a block in New York City, 3 blocks away, so that the householder could walk there without having to take a vehicle. Okay, so it says, some gamblers were playing dice not far from the Buddha. And so now the householder goes to the gamblers as if the gamblers are going to be able to give him wise advice, how to live properly. If you want to get that advice, you don't go to the Buddha, but you go to the gamblers who are, risking their accumulated wealth by playing this rather risky game. So the householder goes to the gamblers and tells him what about his conversation with the Buddha. And so now the gamblers, I'm on page 719 now, when the householder reports this, including his own opinion, the gamblers say, "So it is, householder, so it is. Happiness and joy are born from those who are dear, arise from those who are dear." And so then the householder departs thinking, I agree with the gamblers, not with the Buddha. So in the householder's opinion, the wise man is, or the wise men are the gamblers, not the fully enlightened one, the blessed one who's an arahat, fully enlightened, endowed with knowledge and conduct, well gone, knower of the world, and so on. But rather the wise ones are the gamblers who are probably drunkards, womanizers, dissolute, speculators, drug pushes, whatever. Okay, so once the householder reported this to the gamblers, then either the householder or the gamblers or even others started speaking about this. So the story starts spreading around, through the grapevine of Savatthi, until eventually it reaches the ears of King Pasenadi of Kosala. So this is why I said the setting in Savatthi has some connection with the rest of the discourses. The rest of the discourse, because King Pasenadi is the king of Kosala, and the city of Savatthi is the capital of Kosala. So once the story starts spreading through the city of Kosala, through the city of Savatthi, eventually it will reach the king of Kosala who dwells in Savatthi. So King Pasenadi hears this. He has, as a king, he'll have spies working throughout the city to find out if there's any rebellion, any treachery going on, just as our government exercises these surveillance process to find out if there's any rebellion or uprising in the process. Okay, so King Pasenadi hears about this, and then he's in conversation with his queen Malika, and he tells Malika, he says, "This is what has been said by the recluse Gautama, that sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are born from those who are dear, arise from those who are dear." Okay, now what is the relationship here between King Pasenadi and Queen Malika? Queen Malika had been originally what they call a flower girl, a poor girl who was just selling flowers, in the shop or on the street side. And she had given some gift to the Buddha, and she developed instantaneous faith in the Buddha as soon as she saw him. And so this must have created some kind of great accumulation of merit. And one day when King Pasenadi was driving through the town of Savatthi, he saw Queen Malika, and he was instantly stricken with love for her. Even though it said that she was not very pretty, but somehow there must have been a close karmic connection between them from past lives, and now she had a great accumulation of merit by giving some offering to the Buddha. And so somehow the merit and the past life connection came together, and when King Pasenadi saw her on the roadside selling the flowers, he fell in love with her, and then he asked her to become his wife, and he appointed her to position of chief queen. And at this point in the sutta, apparently, Queen Malika is a disciple or follower of the Buddha. But at this point, King Pasenadi is not yet a follower of the Buddha. How can we tell this? How can we know this? Even just from the sentence that I just read. There's some indication here that he's not yet a follower of the Buddha. Any idea? Excuse me? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if he was a follower of the Buddha, he would call him Bhagava. He would call him the Blessed One, but he refers to him as the samana, the ascetic Gautama. So that's usually indicative of somebody who doesn't yet have the confidence or trust in the Buddha. And then we'll see from what follows that it reinforces this point that King Pasenadi, in fact, he gets a bit angry with with Malika because of her faith in the Buddha. Okay, so King Pasenadi reports what he heard to Queen Malika. And Queen Malika says, if that has been said by the Blessed One, sire, then it must be so. So from this, we could see that Mallika is a follower of the Buddha. And how can we see that? Apart from the fact that she agrees with whatever he says. Yeah, she refers to the Buddha. She doesn't say, if this was said by the ascetic Gautama, but she says, if that was said by the Blessed One, by the Bhagava, then it must be so. And now King Pasenadi, it seems he's getting angry with her. And maybe what underlies that anger? Something else? Maybe some other emotion goes along with that anger or underlies it. Human emotions here. Yeah, who said that? Oh, you're wrong. Yeah, exactly. Because probably Mallika doesn't agree with everything that King Pasenadi says. You know, if she hears something, King Pasenadi says this. Or if the king tells her something, she might say, well, sire, maybe we should look at it from a different point of view. And then the king will get angry, why don't you agree with me? But when she hears that the Buddha said something, she doesn't say automatically, then it must be so, but she says, if the Buddha said that, then it's so. So there's a conditional here. But now the king gets angry and he says, no matter what this recluse Gautama says, Mallika applauds it. And maybe he's speaking in this way, he's saying, if this was said by the Blessed One, then it must be so, you know, sort of mocking her with his voice. And then he goes on, just as a pupil applauds whatever the teacher says to him, so it is, teacher, so it is, teacher. So Mallika, no matter what the recluse Gautama says, you applaud it. If that was said by the Blessed One, then it must be so. And then he gets really angry with her and just dismisses her. He says, get away, you know, be off, get out of here. You know, he's probably really furious. I think mainly because of that, as Yurang pointed out, because there's jealousy underlying that. Maybe she feels, maybe the king feels that, you know, he doesn't have the complete loyalty, complete submission of his wife. Okay, but now Queen Mallika, she's said to be, even though she was not very pretty, but she was very, very clever. And so now, first she wants to have confirmation that the Buddha said this, because this is just a report that she heard. And so she's not yet ready to put complete trust in it because she doesn't know if the Buddha actually said that. And so she addresses a Brahmin. The Brahmin's name is not consequential, named Nalichanga. And it's interesting here, it shows something interesting about the social structure in the eastern part of India. And what is that? Maybe Richard would have some comment about that. Yeah, well, it seems to show that the Brahmins were serving almost as messengers within the court. And we find in the Buddhist texts, when the Buddhist texts are speaking about the four social classes, they always put the Kshatriya above the Brahmin. So there seems to have been like a rivalry in the eastern part of India. In the western part and central part, the Brahmins, it seemed, had already established their dominance in the caste or class structure.
My understanding of that is that really the Kshatriya always were on top, because they were the warriors, the landlords, the politicians,
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah.
But that it gradually developed that they gave deference to the Brahmins because they found that if they respected the Brahmins, that they had less trouble.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that kings gave deference to the Pope.
Yeah. Yeah.
For the same reason, that is the same kind of relationship. Actually, the king had the power. Well, I pretend that the
Okay, maybe so, but what I've read is that there were two somewhat different social systems between Western and Central India, particularly the part what's called the Kuru country, and the eastern part, state of Magadha, as far as dominance goes. I read this, it's a book by, the author is Jeffrey Samuels, The Origins of Yoga and Tantra, where he deals with the development. It would be good if you take the microphone.
Yeah. The British used different tax collecting systems and different land ownership systems in different parts of India. But you know, for instance, in northeast India, the zamindari were most powerful, and that was a position that one got by auction. That is, that you bought the ability to collect taxes because you could collect far more than you were obligated to pay. So, but that was only for about 20% of India. I think these things have moved around at a lot of in different times. And Kathmandu always has had a different kind. Or that is, the hill country of Nepal has always had a different caste system from the plains and so on. But the thing is that the Indian Empire has been different through time. It's moved all over the map. And meanwhile, there's a substructure of principalities. At the time that the British took over, there were 546. And so the principalities maintained some integrity no matter where the empire went. I suspect that the relationships changed as the empire shifted. May have changed a number of times. So the time is important.
Okay, anyway, we'll continue with the discourse. Okay, so Queen Malika gives this instruction to the Brahmin. She says, go to the Blessed One, pay homage to him, ask about his health, and then say to him, Bhante, I've heard these words. There's this statement that's ascribed to you that sorrow, lamentation, and so forth arise from those who are dear. Then she says, learn well what the Blessed One replies and report it to me, for the Tathagatas, the enlightened ones, do not speak untruth. Okay, so then the Brahmin goes to the Buddha, reports this to him, and now we come to page 720, paragraph 7. The Buddha says, so it is, Brahmin, so it is. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are born from those who are dear, arise from those who are dear. And now the Buddha is going to illustrate this with a number of examples that he must have encountered on his own. So he says, it can be understood in this way how sorrow and so forth arise from those who are dear. Once in this city of Savatthi, there was a certain woman whose mother died. Then because of her mother's death, she went mad, she lost her mind, and she wandered through the streets asking, have you seen my mother? Have you seen my mother? And then basically what follows are just variations on this. A woman whose father died, whose brother, sister, son, daughter, husband died, and so forth. And then comes the converse case of 15 to 21, a man whose mother died, father died, and so on, whose wife died. Okay, then comes the most extreme case, paragraph 22. Once in the same Savatthi, there was a certain woman who went to live with her relative's family. Then her relatives wanted to divorce her from her husband, or separate her from her husband, and give her to another man whom she did not want. And so then this man reported to her husband that my relatives want to take me away from you and to give me to another man. And this man must have been very much in love with his wife and felt that because of the power that the relatives held over her, that they had no way to live together as husband and wife. I don't know why they couldn't have just run away together, but anyway, this is the sequel. That first the man, it's rather brutal here, that as you sometimes see in news reports, the following report contains graphic elements. If you think you might have difficulty with this, please turn off your TV for a few minutes. Okay, so the man was so stricken with grief over the thought of losing this woman that he first killed the woman, cutting her body in half, and then he took a knife and plunged it into his own belly, disemboweling himself, thinking, we shall be together in the afterlife. And so in this way it can be understood how sorrow, lamentation, and so forth arise from those who are dear. We sometimes read in newspapers or hear on news reports about sometimes like a boy and a girl fall in love. I used to read reports like this in Sri Lanka. It used to come every couple of weeks in the newspaper, that there would be a boy and a girl, maybe they're from different castes, different communities, Sinhala and Tamil, or sometimes from different income, people in different income brackets. Or maybe the family had a long-standing dispute, the families had a long-standing dispute, the boy and the girl fall in love, the parents don't want them to stay together, and usually what they do, it's not as violent as this, but what they do is to drink together. They will drink insecticide, or sometimes throw themselves off a cliff. One finds these steep cliffs in Sri Lanka. Do you know any stories about this from your own experience? Mm-hmm. Same story, yeah. Okay, so after the Buddha spoke in this way, then the Brahmin gets up and goes to Queen Malika and reports this conversation to her. Okay, now Queen Malika, as I said, she's very intelligent, very clever, and so she's not going to go to the king and tell the king directly, that's what the Buddha said, I've got confirmation of this, therefore now I can believe it. But rather, she's going to use a kind of tactic, a kind of indirect method to get the king to actually agree with the Buddha. Apparently she's counting on I have to say, the short memory of the king. Because if the king really had a good memory, then he would remember that the questions that the Queen Malika is going to ask him are referring back to that previous conversation. And he would realize that the queen is trying to get him into a trap. But it seems she's counting on the fact that maybe he's preoccupied with affairs of state, so that conversation might have seemed to him to be just a trivial matter that's now over and done with. So her questions won't ring a bell with him and remind him of their previous conversation. So Queen Malika just, maybe she snuggles up to him, brings him maybe a tray of sweets and some nice drink, and then she says, what do you think, O sire? Is Princess Vajiri dear to you? That's his daughter. And so the king says, yes, Malika, Princess Vajiri is dear to me. Okay, and then she says, what do you think, sire? If change and alteration took place in Princess Vajiri, would sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair arise in you? And here, by change and alteration, it seems that the Pali words, it's viparinama anyatabhava, suggest that she gets seriously ill or dies. or maybe she gets seriously injured. So it's not just changing her clothes or changing from one school to another, or developing a new hobby, but some serious change, deterioration in her condition. And so the king admits that yes, if some change were to take place, some deterioration in Princess Vajiri, that would mean an alteration in my life. It's like my whole life would be turned upside down. I'd be just plunged into misery, even into sorrow, grief, and despair. And I suspect that at this point, because Queen Malika is going to continuing with the questions, probably at this point in the actual conversation, she didn't spring on the king the fact that that's what the Buddha meant by his statement. Otherwise, the other questions would be pointless. I would suspect in the real conversation that the queen just went on asking similar questions about other relations of the king. And then only at the very end did he spring that statement, did she spring that statement on the king. So the queen goes on questioning about Queen Vasabha. That would be another wife of the king, because in those days the kings were not monogamous by any means, but they would have several wives. Then General Vidudaba, this was the king's son, who, though he's at this point he's dear and beloved to the king, but actually later in life, General Vidudaba was to overthrow his father and take control of the throne and leave his father as just in exile outside the state of Savatthi. Okay, and then Queen Malika, maybe a little humbly and probably a little nervously, she asks, "Am I dear to you?" And then the king would say, "Yes, you are dear to me." Then she would say, "If I were to get sick or to die, would you become miserable?" And the king says, "Yes." Then Malika asks, "Are Kasi and Kosala dear to you?" Kosala is the kingdom over which King Pasenadi is ruling, and Kasi seems to have been, you call this, a outpost of the kingdom, or dominion of the kingdom, another state that had been annexed by the state of Kosala. And so it was from Kasi, especially, that the state of Kosala was able to get sandalwood and very special fabrics that were considered the highest grade of cloth in northern India. The state of Kasi, that's where the city of Benares or Varanasi is located. And so Varanasi is famous for its incense and for the cloth. If you ever go to Varanasi, you see in all of the shops, there are so many shops selling this very fine quality cloth even today. And probably in northern India, it might be the center for the sandalwood incense. In South India, what is the center for incense? Anybody know? If you ever get the Indian incense, usually you see on the label, made in, starts with an M.
Madras, Chennai.
No. Mysore. If you have Indian incense, just look on the label. So perhaps now it's the manufacture of incense is spread to other cities. But back in the 1970s, I think, even the late 1960s, when I used to get my first packets of Indian incense, I always used to notice, made in Mysore, made in Mysore. And then I think it was the year 2000, 2001, I visited Mysore, and through the streets of the bazaar, one always sees incense shop after incense shop after incense shop. Okay, so King Pasenadi, he admits that the states of Kasi and Kosala are dear to him because they are the source of these essential commodities, or these luxuries. And so then she asks, what do you think if some change were to take place in these states? If some other king were to appropriate them, wouldn't you become miserable and grief-stricken? And the king says, certainly that would be the case. Okay, and now I think, in my view of the actual conversation, it's at this point that the queen springs that consequence on King Pasenadi. She says, it was reference to this that the Blessed One who knows and sees, the Arahat, the fully enlightened one, said, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are born from those who are dear, arise from those who are dear. And somehow that statement must have made a strong impact on the king. And also he would have recognized that he had painted himself into a corner, so to speak, by making these confessions. But now he comes to recognize the truth in the Buddha's words, and so he exclaims to Queen Malika, he says, it's wonderful, Malika, it's marvelous how far the Blessed One penetrates with wisdom and sees with wisdom. And with that statement, it seems that the king has gained confidence or trust in the Buddha. Maybe because the king, maybe having a masculine type of mind, depends for his trust on logical argumentation, whereas Malika, having the feminine mind, will base her decisions on faith, trust, and devotion. So now that the argument has been driven home to the king, and he's seen the point of the Buddha's statement, now he recognizes that the Buddha is speaking on the basis of wisdom. So now he asks for what's called here ablution water, which simply means that the king is now going to make a declaration of homage to the Buddha. So before this, he takes this water to wash his hands and to wash his mouth. Perhaps that was a custom in India in the Buddha's time. So after getting the ablution water and using it, then the king gets up from his seat and he puts his upper robe over one shoulder. That's a sign of respect. And then he extends his hands, he joins the hands and extends them in Anjali, that gesture of salutation. So he does Anjali in the direction of Jeta's Grove, where the Buddha is usually living. And then he exclaims 3 times, homage to the Blessed One, the Arahat, the fully enlightened one. This is Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. So he recites this 3 times. And it seems that it's at this point that King Pasenadi is beginning to get trust in the Buddha, but he still hasn't gained complete trust in the Buddha. That complete trust will come on a later occasion when King Pasenadi meets the Buddha himself and enters into a conversation with him. This conversation is recorded in the Samyutta Nikāya. It's the Kosala Samyutta. That's the 3rd chapter in the Samyutta Nikāya, Sutta number 1. On that occasion, King Pasenadi met the Buddha in person, and then he said to the Buddha, and we could see that this all takes place at a pretty early point in the Buddha's teaching career, since King Pasenadi says to the Buddha, it's reported that you are a fully enlightened one, and you claim to be fully enlightened, but you're just a youngster. The Buddha at that time, we could say, he achieved enlightenment at what age, according to the tradition? 35, yeah. And the king is also young, because from another sutta that will come to the next time we meet, we learn that King Pasenadi and the Buddha are the same age, born in the same year. But King Pasenadi says to the Buddha, he says that there are there are several other ascetics who are old, aged, advanced in years, and even they don't claim to be fully enlightened. And here you are, just relative youngster, maybe the Buddha, 37, 30, let's suppose 36, 37, 38 years old, and you're claiming to be fully enlightened. Even now, like if somebody came up to me and said, you know, he's like a 35-year-old monk, and people are saying, he's an arhat. I would think immediately, he's just 35, 36 years old. I'm 67 years old. How could he be an arhat and I'm not? Okay, so King Pasenadi says to the Buddha, you claim to be a fully enlightened one, but you're just a youngster. And he says this almost with like a disparaging tone. Then the Buddha replies to King Pasenadi in, first I think he replies in prose, and he says, there are 4 things, O king, that should not be despised just because they're young. What are these 4 things? 1 is a fire. The 2nd is a viper, a poisonous snake. The 3rd is a kshatriya prince, and probably has the king in mind when he says that. And the 4th is a shramana, an ascetic. Then in the verses he explains that if one despises or devalues a fire when young, just a little fire, and you don't pay any attention to it, that fire will flare up and it can consume houses and palaces and just reduce a whole city just to ashes, to rubble, to waste. You might despise or mistreat a young viper, but that viper might remember you, and when that viper grows up, if you cross paths with that viper and it remembers you, it will strike you and bite, and its bite could take your life. If you denigrate or despise a young kshatriya who's destined to become the king, then when he becomes the king, he'll remember you, and then he'll order you to be arrested, punished. It might even take your life. And if you despise or mistreat a young shramana, if that young shramana, though the young samana, because he's developing loving kindness and compassion, he doesn't intentionally harm the king, but if with an angry, hateful mind one despises him and denigrates him, then one will generate unwholesome karma that will eventually bear fruit and can bring one suffering and misfortune. Then after the Buddha speaks these verses, then King Pasenadi gains complete trust in the Buddha, and then he bows down to the Buddha and takes the refuges from the Buddha, goes for refuge to the Buddha. Okay, so this is the sutta. Anybody have any comments about this? I mean, this seems like a pretty strong statement that sorrow, lamentation, misery are born from those who are dear. And it seems to me, to be quite common sense. Can't we also say that happiness and joy are also born from those who are dear? Why should one take just a one-sided view of the situation? Why just... Doesn't it seem to lead to a kind of negative or pessimistic view of life? Like if Johnny here were to say that from his wife Sandy, there arises just lamentation, misery, suffering, and despair, how would you feel? Anything the Buddha says, you say is true. Okay, in the last, what is? But take the microphone so everybody can hear.
So according to this one, in order to have no suffering, we shouldn't love anybody.
You certainly what?
No, in order to no suffering,
Yeah.
no sorrow or something, we shouldn't fall love to anybody.
We shouldn't fall.
We shouldn't love anybody.
We shouldn't fall in love with anybody.
Yeah, is that true? If you love anybody,
Yeah.
if somebody have something changed,
Yeah.
some trouble will come to you. So if you don't love anybody, you
Yeah.
no trouble at all.
But I know you're married and you have a
Yeah.
son.
Yes.
Don't you find happiness and joy from your wife and from your son?
Yes.
Yeah.
But the problem is if my son makes some trouble,
Yeah.
I will always occupy my mind.
Yeah.
But if I have no son, so I don't have this trouble. So.
Okay. Let's say what is your name? Yeah.
Me?
Yeah. With the yellow shirt.
Oh, thank you.
Your name?
Michael.
Michael. Okay.
Okay, I'm thinking that to derive suffering and to derive happiness from one who is dear is essentially the same thing, because it's not so much the deriving happiness perhaps or the deriving suffering from one who is dear, but the attachment and the unchanging attachment
That's
to
a
it.
very good point. Yeah.
So consequently, we become attached to the idea that we have it's like a photograph. You take a photograph and it doesn't change, but life changes of somebody, but life changes around it.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Let's say if Katie has in the back, sitting on the back.
I think I was just going to say roughly the same thing, and Master Shin Ying has a talk on this as well, Shin Yen, that kind of the idea, if you really do love something, it's completely free of oneself, that one can't really love all children if one prides their own children. And then there's something different. And I think that's where there's no conflict between the Bodhisattva path or the Arahat path sometimes.
Anybody else have any comment? Anybody with any children? Please, take the microphone. And what is your name?
Stephen.
Stephen, okay.
I was wondering, this discourse brings to mind a different discourse, which unfortunately I don't remember the name, but it's the one about a lady who runs to where the Buddha is staying with wet hair to say, my son has died, this is really terrible. And he basically tells her, well, what about all the other children that have died today? And what about the children that may die tomorrow? Are you going to come back here with wet hair every day, so upset? But in that discourse, he seems to talk, or at least the message I got was a bit more about addressing the ideas of metta or karuna. And this discourse doesn't seem to talk so much about compassion and love. And I'm wondering why it does have this kind of dark feeling and not teaching us about how one should approach these attachments.
Okay, first, let me just summarize the discourse that you have in mind. If it's the same one that I have in mind, it doesn't actually bring in metta and karuna. But tell me if this is the one. It occurs in the Udana, a little work called the Udana, the Buddha has a lay woman disciple, her name is Visakha, and she comes to the Buddha during the day, again with wearing the distinctive funeral clothes with the wet hair. And then the Buddha says, "Why are you coming here in the middle of the day with your hair wet?" It seems that was a symbol somehow of grieving. And then she says, "My granddaughter, dear and beloved, has died." And then the Buddha says, "Would you like to have as many grandchildren as there are children in this city of Savatthi?" And she says, "Oh yes, I would like to have like 1,000 grandchildren." And then the Buddha says, "If you had 1,000 grandchildren, then each time one of them died, you would be grieving." Is that the one that you have in mind? Yeah. So here again, and then the verses sort of emphasize the point. The verses that go with that sutta say that for one who has 1,000 dear ones, there's 1,000 sorrows. For one who has 100 dear ones, there are 100 sorrows. For one who has 10 dear ones, there are 10 sorrows. For one who has no dear ones, there is no sorrow. But I think the point that you make is true, that there's a distinction, or we should actually say that this is the case, and this agrees well with the point that Michael made about attachment underlying this endearment, that there's a distinction between metta, which is, we call it universal love or loving kindness, and Pema. Pema is affection. The affection usually with the sense that there's some kind of a personal attachment underlying it. But then should the message be that everybody should give up all personal affection immediately? That seems pretty strong.
I'm just reminded by a story I heard, or what I heard, that Queen Elizabeth said after September 11th, and I'm just going to paraphrase, but something to the effect of, like, grief is the price we pay for love. And just to echo what else has been said, perhaps that there is a bit of a transaction that occurs around it, almost, that we can, that we have, perhaps we can accept the price of it. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily the only thing that we experience, that there could be a range. Maybe that's a little bit what I get from this.
Yeah. Okay, Katie wants to. Wait, take the microphone.
I think you asked, that seems, or you mentioned it seems a bit extreme to not have relative affection. I just think that there's certain gratifications that are completely natural to a social species, the human brain, I can say.
Yeah.
And so to see someone familiar to me that is also a friend and I have lots of good memories with, just to see them, to unexpectedly see them, it's completely natural for the brain to experience a surge in maybe delta phos B, whatever.
Yeah.
It's unnatural to refute a little affection.
Yeah.
But if it's understood in this bath of a nature of things, I think so there's that is just calming the natural reaction of the brain. And then there's the second part of taking care of one's local family, and that can also involve, it doesn't mean, abandon affections and parents immediately.
Yeah, that's exactly the point that I would have wanted to make. Even when we read the suttas, extensively, we see that between certain of the monks who are arahats, there are like certain bonds of natural affection, like Sariputta and Ananda. Sariputta and Moggallana were very good friends, and you don't see Sariputta sort of palling around with some of the other monks, maybe like Mahakachana. You hardly ever see them mentioned in the same sutta, but often Moggallana and Sariputta are together. I think Anuruddha and Mahakassapa have Mahakassapa is a little of a fierce type, but the hard loner type, but they seem to get along pretty well together. So there seem to be natural ties of affection between certain people based upon, sometimes it can be psychological complementarity, where their characters complement one another. In certain cases it can be a kind of a natural sympathy or empathy because of similarities in their character. But I think the essential point is that the relationship should be embedded within a realization of, through wisdom or understanding. This is adequately, nicely expressed in a formula that the Buddha teaches, that all of his disciples, he says, whether they are renunciants, monastics, or lay people, should often reflect on this. And it's a statement, Sabbehi me piyehi manapehi nana bhavo vina bhavoti, that from all who are dear and agreeable to myself, there must be parting and separation. So if one has a clear understanding that inevitably at some point there's going to be separation from everyone that I love and have affection for, then one can have a close relationship with them based upon love and affection. But that relationship, to the extent that one understands this, will not be dominated by this attachment and clinging. So we could say that there is a natural, wholesome, healthy type of love and affection, but very often what becomes parasitic on that love and affection is the clinging and the attachment. So I think the point of this sutta is, not to allow that clinging and attachment to develop on the basis of that natural love and affection. If we look at, again, I have to say, like a wide range of suttas, not just the direct discourses of the Buddha, but those suttas that have narrative portions, we see how relationships develop. And even when, after Sariputta and Moggallana passed away, this is in Satipatthana Samyutta, it's chapter 47 in the Samyutta Nikāya. It could be sutta number 12, 13, 14, somewhere around there. The Buddha is looking out over the assembly of monks, and then he says, now that Sariputta and Moggallana have passed away, this assembly appears to me to be empty. Very strong words. He uses the word sunyo, like sunyata, but not in the philosophical sense. But he says that it's just as though there were a big tree with a great trunk, and it had two big branches, and one passes that tree, regularly, on and off, one passes the tree, and one is always acquainted with the image of this big tree with its two big branches. Then suddenly, one day, the two big branches collapse, and one passes by the tree again, and one notices at once that, the tree is just not its old self anymore. The two big branches that gave that tree its distinctive character have collapsed. And so the tree now seems as though it's been reduced to about half of or a quarter of its original size. And so the Buddha is saying that, so when I look out at this assembly of monks, it seems to be empty. But then he goes on to say, but even so, there is no sorrow, grief, lamentation, pain, and despair in the Tathagata. Okay, Claudia wants to say something.
Claudia.
Please.
Yeah, it's working, right? Yeah, a few reactions to it. The term that he used of, where was it? Deranged. It's a translation, so I don't know how close it is, but it seems to me to be quite judgmental, which is a surprise.
Let me just take a look. Deranged. I think here, that would be the choice of the translator. I think here I modified Venerable Nyanamoli's original translation. It's Anyat. Let me just see if I could recollect the original Pali word. I think the original word means something, if I remember, it's anyatattang, something like that has undergone some change of state.
That's
so
much more accurate than deranged.
Yeah, okay, maybe deranged was a somewhat strong choice on my part.
Yeah, change of state is exactly the word I would use to the phrase, thank you. I'm also surprised here that it's a conversation, there's so much emphasis on direct experience. And I'm thinking of, like this other sutta you were talking about with the woman with the wet hair, or of the story about the, the seed, someone's supposed to go around and find a home that hasn't been affected. But this is conversational, and as opposed to having a sutta where the king directly experiences the loss.
Yeah, well, this is setting up like a hypothetical situations. You mean the king's conversation with the queen? Yeah, because here Malika is trying to convince the king of the truth of the Buddha's words, and probably the king is quite secure now. He hasn't really undergone any kind of major loss in his life at this point. Of course, I think since he's king, he would have lost his father, because as long as his father was alive, he would have just been the prince, not yet a king. But maybe he just took it in stride because his father was old. There's one thing I want to point out, that often within traditional Buddhist circles, like in traditional Buddhist countries, because of suttas like this and statements like this, there's a feeling amongst people that I would consider to be somewhat of an unwholesome feeling, that if somebody loses a beloved, like a woman loses her husband, the husband loses his wife, the parents lose a child, then naturally they'll feel sorrow and grief, and then they blame themselves that, oh, I'm imperfect, this is my shortcoming, this is a fault of mine, I'm so straddled with these defilements that I break out in sorrow. But what I tell people who have lost loved ones, or who are imagining a situation where they would lose a loved one who's close to them, what I would say is, let oneself feel that grief and sorrow, let it work through the system. That's just the natural feeling that happens when one loses a loved one. One has to take it that maybe one is not yet a fully liberated arahat. So it's quite natural to feel that kind of sorrow and grief, but also balance that sorrow and grief with the recognition that there must be parting and separation from all who are dear and beloved. So if one has that understanding, then one can, just let that sorrow and grief work naturally through the system, and then after a short period of time, by short I don't mean 1 or 2 days, but a couple of weeks, a month or so, one readjusts to one's life without the loved person, and one can, get on with one's day-to-day life. One can start to work, to work again. One will resume one's ordinary activities. Over some time, one might start to develop other relationships. And so one will cherish the memory of the loved one. It doesn't mean that one forgets about them completely, but one recognizes that this is the nature of life, And so one can't be, always tied down by memories of the loved one who has passed away. Just to give an example of this that just came to my mind yesterday. Maybe some of you know Tsuku Lee, who's in charge here of the book distribution program. He's lived at Zhuangyan Monastery for probably almost the time that the monastery was established. Earlier this week, his mother passed away. His mother was 103 years old. Yeah, she had been born, it must have been China in the year 1909, probably the last years. Is this the Qing dynasty? The last years of the Qing dynasty. When she was growing up as a little girl, her elders bound her feet. This was a custom in old China. They consider girls to be beautiful or women to be beautiful and feminine when they have small feet. So the elders would bind the feet so that when the girl grows up, she has these very small, delicate feet. She lived through, the birth of the Chinese Republic, then the 1930s, the Japanese occupation, World War II in mainland China, then the Communist Revolution in 1948-49. Then from China, she had to flee to Taiwan, probably, 49 or 50. Then after her children became established in the U.S., she moved to the U.S., and she continued to live on Long Island for many years. I think she came 1974, they said at the funeral, if I remember. Until just a few days ago. So she passes away at the age of 103, and then her children and one grandchild were giving talks, we call these appreciation talks at the funeral. And the grandson and two of her sons, as they were speaking, they would be weeping. And even one of the sons was weeping so much that he couldn't continue to speak. And so the other relatives had to tell him, just sit down. But when Tsuku came to speak, he was quite calm. Which to my mind, it doesn't mean that he didn't love his mother, but because he's well-grounded in Buddhist understanding, so he knows that, everyone has to pass away. And like when my teacher, Venerable Nyanaponika, passed away, I lived with him for 10.5 years in the Forest Hermitage in Kandy. This was an elder German monk who was living in Sri Lanka since 1936. He's the author of some very important books in English on Buddhism, especially The Heart of Buddhist Meditation. He passed away. I came to live with him in 1984. I lived with him up to the time of his death, 1994. He was 93 years old at the time of his death. So I felt really moved at the time of his death, but it didn't cause me to feel, grief, misery, or sorrow. Because I know he's 93 years old and he had been blind for the last about 3 or 4 years. And so just accepted the fact that he passes away. And so there comes a kind of feeling of being moved as I recollect our close relationship, our spiritual friendship. But I wasn't lamenting why have you gone so soon? Why don't you stay around a few more years? But there was another woman in Sri Lanka that I know. She was the typesetter for the Buddhist Publication Society in the 1990s. And she lost her husband about a year ago? About a few months ago? Yeah, a few months ago. And she should know better because she's typed all of the books on Buddhism for years and years. She lost her husband, and then she wrote to me a couple of weeks ago that now her life feels so empty, she feels so miserable, and she's sure that her husband is going to come back, and she's just waiting for him to come back, expecting her husband to come back I wrote back to her that even if he's born as a little baby right next to her, how is she going to know that this is her husband who's come back? And by the time her husband gets to be 20 years old, she might be 60, she'll be 80 years old now. So what relationship could there be between a young man of 20 and now an old woman of 80? Okay, so I think this is the message of the sutta. Richard, you have something to add? Please take the microphone.
This looks to me like advice for detachment, and that kind of troubles me for this reason.
Advice for what?
Detachment.
Yeah.
I don't know, is this on?
It's on.
Yeah, it looks like you're saying, okay, the contrast here is between the Buddha saying that, the source of sorrow and so on is one who is dear, and the gamblers and the original speaker saying, well, this is a source of joy and such. But there's also a question of knowledge. That is, if you're detached from people, you really don't know them. There's a whole lot you don't know. I mean, I think of my family, and if I follow events that happen to my kids and my wife every day, and so on, and that's our lives. And if I were detached from them, I really wouldn't understand them. That is, I wouldn't know them. You know them because of all the things that you share. That is, there's something in a relationship that is understandable in no other way. You don't, when you just run into somebody, you don't know what's going on inside of them because people don't give continuous evidence of what life is to them. It develops over time, and it's a creature of time. And without attachment to people, there's no real knowledge of people. And this is what, you see, both of these things are true. Sorrow and lamentation are born from those who were dear, and also joy and happiness are born from those who were dear. And it looks like, there's the one is supposed to be true and the other not true, but they're both true.
That's a good point. No, Katie has some just when you were speaking, she raised her hand, so I think she has some comment on that.
Well, I did want to say, I think this is, and I'm not the only one to say it, that one of the big misunderstandings of Buddhism is not detaching from others, it's detaching from oneself. That's a dissociative disorder, to detach from others and to become cool to them. And I think people do encounter that through the meditative process over years. They may go through, there may be a stage of cool dissociation. But detachment, when people, there's like a society for good listening, I forget what it's called.
The Society for
Listening, good listening skills, so that diplomats and people can detach from themselves the desire to cure another person, the desire to fix another person, the desire to not hear, detaching from aversion, detaching from strong love. It's not detaching from the family member. And this is that transformative moment that allows for a transcendent moment to say, I can actually now see that person better than I saw them before because I've shut up. I'm not suppressing anything. That comes in the work of meditation, to hear what one's own thoughts are, but to come to the table and try to detach from, to not be so moved by one's own emotional state that there can be hearing of the other.
Okay, I think that there are a lot of good points to continue the discussion with. Why don't we sort of adjourn for the lunch break? And then we'll come back at, let's say, 10 after 12 or so, and then we could continue to discuss this after lunch. So please do come back. Okay, Johnny is getting the sharing of the merits. And I should mention that next Saturday we won't have the class because there's a meditation course here. It's an 8-day course in the Brahmaviharas, in loving kindness and compassion, which I think we also have to bring into this discussion, as balances to this kind of detachment that's being advocated here. So next Saturday we won't have the class, but I think the meditation course continues to the following Saturday, But that Saturday we'll have the class. If the meditation course is on here, in this room, then we'll have the class in the library, because I don't want to cancel 2 classes. And if you're interested if you have the time and interest to attend the retreat, you could either register for it online at the website, the Buddhist Association of the United States, or you can go to the office and speak to somebody in the office. This will be the meditation retreat on what they call the divine abodes or sublime abodes, loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. Oh, there's a question here from the internet. Let me just see. Seems that the attachment described contains 2 roots. Isn't there clinging in both of these, even though this moves between being underlain by greed and aversion? I guess he means that there's greed in clinging to the person and then aversion towards the loss of the person. Yeah, that seems to be the case. Yeah. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. We share the merits from the meditation session, the speaking on Dhamma, listening on Dhamma, discussing the Dhamma. We share the merits with the devas, the deities that protect the Dhamma, with the fair spirits, the Buddhas, the Nagas, and all beings, wishing them to be well and happy and achieve their good purposes. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva shirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi dang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagopadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sannino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibbutting. Okay, we stand and then we do 3 half bows to Buddha.